Let's just start this morning. And let me just say, it's so good to see you. I know it's a challenge for some of us to get out. I know it's a lot of people to get out of the door sometimes. And we just are so grateful, though, to have that chance to come together. So pray with me real quick before we begin, and just let's ask the Lord to help us to be able to focus, to learn, and to apply the things that are going to be shared with us today out of the Word. So if you would, pray with me. God, we thank you once again, as has been repeated over and over, for the opportunity to be here with God's people. And God, we pray right now that you will be with us and help us, encourage us, strengthen us, give us understanding. I pray that the words will be clear. I pray that, Father, you will, by your Spirit, take them and work in our hearts. We pray all these things now, trusting you. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, we're surrounded now, when you look at major world events, with all sorts of things. If I say Ukraine, you have thoughts that come to your mind, correct? If I say China, there's unique tensions that Americans feel in regards to that. If we mention pandemic, even now in 2023, there's ripple effects, are there not? I mean, there's complications and new things that we face because of that. So there's all these issues on the global scale that are there, but there's actually a lot of issues closer to home. There's tons of social unrest. We could unsettle everyone with just throwing out a word or two. Immigration, or race relations, or perhaps consider gender issues. Abortion. When you hear these things, it feels like we're in the midst of chaos, does it not? And frankly, it stirs up anxiety and tensions within us. It may drive you to ask questions like this: what does it look like to be a Christian in the midst of all these things? And beyond how should I act, there's the question of how does the world perceive us as Christians in the midst of all these things? Are we living in such a way that there's integrity before God as we react to the circumstances of life? I want to throw out a proposition to you as we begin today that I think will help us, and it will actually take this global concern and chaos and tension and bring it to a place of what do we do and how can we do. Here's the statement I want to make. Our presentation as Christians on a global scale is a reflection of our true character in the ordinary, day-to-day, unobserved rhythms of life. Let me read that one more time. Our presentation as Christians on a global scale, what others see us to be, that presentation is a reflection of our true character in the ordinary, day-to-day, unobserved rhythms of life. Now, as I say that, I completely understand that Christians, in relation to these issues, are often misrepresented. A Christian view of sexual ethics, for example, might end up getting you thought of or spoken of as a bigot. Our positions of turning the other cheek might actually have people look at you and say, you must be guilty if you're not going to fight back. But generally speaking, I would say this over the long haul: our testimony is established and verified by our daily Christian behavior, not by our grand public posturing. In point of fact, sometimes the Christian world's public posturing right now becomes undercut by this inconsistency in daily living. And when that happens, the world not only dismisses us, but actually discredits the God and the gospel that we claim. Are y'all following what I'm saying here? So here's what's going to happen today in this passage that April has read for us. It's not going to be necessarily a deep, abstract theological thinking. It's going to be rather a practical theological application. We're going to have the gospel that Paul's testimony presented to us back in chapter 1. We're going to have this pillar and buttress of the truth that we thought about in chapter 3 come down to some very practical implications for us today. Last week when we came together, we actually talked about treating each other as family. You remember that? We spoke of God as who? He's a father. Christ is our brother. We spoke of ourselves as adopted. We spoke of ourselves as heirs in his family and what it is to act with family love and respect and care for others. What does that look like in the text we read today as he carries the thought further? Here's the point for today. As Christian family, in our ordinary daily rhythms, we must honor the widows among us with our care for them. That's about as simple and practical as you can get. As Christian family, we must honor the widows among us with our care for them. Next week, we're going to actually continue in this and talk about the character and ministry of the widows. But this week, we're going to talk about care for the widows who are among us. There's a verse in James chapter 1 that says this. Religion, which is a bad word in some people's mind, but religion is basically just the outworking of your faith. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. There's a quality of this religion, this outworking of your faith, that's stated in the negative in this verse. It says that we need to abstain from the world's ways that mar our relationship with God. And I'm afraid, brothers and sisters, that we spend a lot of time reacting to the world in the very same way that the world reacts, that our flesh is driving us to react, that ends up staining us. There's a different way that is the way of Jesus. However, it doesn't just give us a negative, like keep yourself away from the ways of the world. It actually gives us a positive outworking or an action in that verse. And that is to do this: care for orphans and widows. It actually says to visit them. And when I think visit, I'm thinking about, I go to your house and knock on the door and come in and sit down and we have coffee and then leave. It's more intense in the word than that. It's actually to look upon or after, to help them or to benefit them, is what the word visit here actually is referring to. And it speaks of orphans and widows. We can put it this way: it is the looking after, the seeking to help and benefit the vulnerable, those who are exposed without defense or resource. It's to look after, to help and benefit the weak, those who are limited in their ability to provide their own defense or their own resources. It's actually to look after, to help and benefit the anonymous, the person that among most persons in the world are unrecognized and unimportant. And it's to look after, to help and to benefit when it's costly. When those who receive the help from you have no ability to help you back. You can't monetize the help. You aren't necessarily rewarded for the help or the care or the provision that you give. Now, technically, this term widow, we know what that is. It speaks of women strictly who have lost a husband. That is, especially in the culture in which this is written, they've lost not only their companion, but they've also lost their provider. It's not that these persons are like incapable of contribution, but they are incredibly limited in their economic sustainability and they're also limited in their ability to relate or have relational connection. Their means of income has been diminished, and relationally, they are at this point alone. So how is it that we're going to care for this widow, this vulnerable one, this needy one, this one who can't give back necessarily? How is it that we do this? How do we practically discern who is it that we need to help? And how do we take our finite resources and actually allocate them to the care of those who are in need? Now, the text is going to help us a lot here. It's going to give some practical guidelines to quietly and consistently and fairly help the vulnerable among us. There's some touch points in the text that I want us to be able to follow as we look through it. The directive or the instruction in the text is that we are to honor those who are true widows. If you want to know what your action point is today, that's it. Honor those who are true widows. But the criteria for true widow is also going to be laid out in this text. We're going to see what is the circumstance of need for this person. And then we're also going to see what is the character of hope in this person. So honor of true widows based on the circumstance of need that they have and the character of hope that's in them. Verse 3 makes the statement that's the directive. Honor those who are true widows. The word honor, we hear it a lot. We just finished Memorial Day. There's an honoring of persons. We hear that word. What does it actually mean? Well, the term honor here basically carries this connotation. It is to recognize and to value, to hold up as revered and respected. And it actually carries the idea of more than lip service. It's to value in such a way that you actually step in to provide care, to make provision. It goes past your words and it goes to resources and physical respect. It's actually an extension of what we hear in the fifth commandment. You remember what the fifth commandment is? The fifth commandment is honor your father and your mother. Well, in the context of this being a church family, as we spoke of last week, there's a responsibility for the church to then honor those who are true widows, the mothers of our body. So the indicative is there. Honor those who are true widows. But you might then ask, well, who truly is a widow? What makes a person a widow that needs to have us step in and care for her? Well, the text is going to lay it out for us. The first thing is there's a circumstance of need there. The text is really clear when you look there in verse 5 that this particular person, there is a lack of family support for her. It says that she has been left truly alone. The text is driving us to understand this, and we need to understand this for our own homes and families. The responsibility for widows first lies with the family. You see the scenario here? It says that if she has children or grandchildren, then they need to provide the care for her. She receives care from the family. Why is it that the family should do that for her? Look what it says there. It says, first of all, that they're going to do this in verse number 4 because it's a return for her care for them. And not only, look, when you were a little baby, we've got some little babies around here. What are they doing in the relationship between the mom and the baby? Who's caring for who? The little baby's not changing anybody's clothes or washing anyone's dishes. No, it's the parent who's cared long for this child. And as this one grows to be older and becomes the widow, the older woman here, there's a return of, you cared for me in my youth, I will care for you in your old age. So there's clearly here a return for her care. And then it goes past that, though, to say that this actual act in the end of verse 4, it's actually pleasing in the sight of God. It's an honoring of that principle of honoring father and mother. I've seen this work its way out time and time again. Louette actually works at an assisted living facility. And so there's an ongoing turnover of persons that come there. They come and they stay there in their latter years of life. And it's so fascinating. I can think of a specific person who, his mom is there. His mom is demented. She doesn't even recognize him. But this man he's retired fireman at this point, but he comes nearly every day. He comes and he cares to talk to her. He has set up provision for her physical care there at the facility. And he has loved her. And you can ask people like him, and he's not the only one. There's others. You can ask them, man, thank you for what you do for your mom. This is awesome. And their answer comes back, how could I do otherwise? She's done so much for me. I can't do anything other than this. If you want a biblical example of this, do you remember back last summer when we actually looked at the book of Ruth? And you saw the example of Ruth with Naomi. The interesting thing there, I think, is Ruth is connected to Naomi not by physical birth, but by marriage. And both Ruth and Naomi are widowed and left in this position of not having resources. However, what they do is Ruth stays with Naomi. They go back to the home of Naomi and they seek for provision from their family. They go and connect with a kinsman redeemer. And in the connection, they end up able to glean the fields for their own physical provision, but they're also then looked after by the family with provision for them. The text actually ends, this is positively what it is. It's pleasing, it's the right thing because it's a return to those parents for what they've done for you. But if you go to the end of this passage in verse number 8, you're going to find out that there's a negative that's stated about not doing so. To not do so is actually, if you look there at the text, it says it's tantamount to a denial or a rejection of your faith. It says if you do not provide for your relatives and especially members of your household, that person is like one who has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. It's something in just the common grace that God gives to all mankind to understand. I will care for those who are my own. So, as you determine what the criteria is, church, for care for these who are in need, there's two aspects to this. Number one, find the ones who are left truly alone. They don't have resource. They don't have relational connection. There's a responsibility to them as a mother. But it also drills down to you and your own home life. I look around and some of us are in a position where we have parents who are older. We have parents who are perhaps in need now of some care. We need to take those responsibilities and those directives quite seriously. And just understand that the Lord is looking for us to show as an example what it is in our ordinary day-to-day life to live as a Christian before a watching world. So that's the first thing. What is their need is the criteria for whether or not this is a true widow who needs to be honored in this fashion. But the second aspect we see in the text is that there's a character of hope in this widow. So this text is interesting. It's not just talking to those who need to give care. It's talking to the widows who are going to receive care. Look in verses 5 and 6. It says that this person, this lady, is one who set her hope on God. And it does it by setting a contrast in verse 5 and verse 6. The contrast is this. Look in verse 5. What does it say that this person who hopes in God is continually doing? It says that they're continually in prayer. There is a dependence on God in this person that is driving her to make request of Him. You know, I don't know how many of you out there are just independent persons and you don't like to ask for help. And you have to get pushed to a point where you cannot do for yourself until you realize I'll need to ask for help. And the Lord is doing that with these ladies. They are alone. They are economically vulnerable. And what is their recourse? They turn to the Lord and request of Him independence. Example in the Scriptures. Do you remember the birth stories of Jesus? And you remember, like, on the 8th day after He's born, they take Him to the temple for circumcision? Do you remember there's two folks that He meets there? One is Simeon, but who's the lady that He meets there, that they meet there? It's a lady by the name of Anna. And if you go read the text in Luke chapter 2, here's what you hear about Anna. Anna was married for 7 years. She's now 84 years old. You can probably do the computations in your own head. If she gets married at 27, she's been for 50 years in a constant state of coming before the Lord. It says in the text that she never ceased in prayer, looking for the Messiah. It's a cry for refuge and salvation that's coming out of Anna. And you know what? The Lord blessed her. Not day one, not week one, and not year one. It was 50 years in, but she saw the Messiah for whom she prayed. I think in this, as we talk, we end up thinking that the one who's actually serving is the one who provides for the physical needs of the widow. And I want to suggest to you that it's very possible that the most important thing that happens in this relationship is the prayer of the widow for others. You often hear it said, well, I'm at a point where there's nothing I can do but pray. And I want to propose to you that the most important thing that you and I can do is pray. Widow, if you find yourself in that position, a person who's vulnerable, the gift of prayer for the body and the gift of prayer for those around you, oh my goodness, it is the most important thing that can be done. As you pray for the little kids in here and their parents who are providing for them, as you pray for those who are out there in the workplace, grinding it out day after day after day, this is massively important. I'll tell you how important it is. I'll give you an example of how important it is. When the Soviet Union came to be, and there's a general atheistic understanding within that expression of communism, there was a suppression of all things so far as religious and worship. However, they did allow for the old ladies to keep praying and keep gathering. You know, they can't hurt anything. They're just old ladies. Leave them alone. It's fine. But when you actually had the communist bloc broken up and come down, they would go in and they would actually find places, like, example, in Ukraine, where pastors would go and visit after all of this has occurred. And they'd go to churches and they would find in those churches that it wasn't just old ladies, but it was men and women and young people who were now coming flooding in, and it was directly the result of their... Let me read to you an account from a pastor who went to visit in Ukraine soon after the fall of the communist curtain. He saw how mistaken the communists were when they allowed the older women to continue worshiping together. It was they who were considered no threat to the new order, but it was they whose prayers and faithfulness over all those barren years held the church together and raised up a generation of men and young people to serve the Lord. Yes, the church we attended was crowded with these older women at the very front, for they had been the stalwart defenders and maintainers of Christ's gospel. But behind them and alongside them and in the balcony and outside the windows were the fruit of their faithfulness, men, women, young people, and children. We must never underestimate the place and the power of our godly women in prayer. Verse 5 speaks of this person who set her hope on God as consistently and constantly in supplication and prayers, night and day. But it's contrasted. There's other persons that find themselves in this place in verse number 6. It says these persons are self-indulgent. They're bent on idolatry. They're bent on self-worship. Now, we can all look at ourselves as this is pointed out. The word for self-indulgent actually is a word that carries the idea of luxurious and voluptuous indulgence. They would take the resources provided and saw it as an entitlement for self rather than for an enablement of service to God and to help others. And the irony is, when you look at the end of verse 6, it speaks of these persons who have taken resources and just lavished it on their own self. It states that they're dead even while they live. The widow who doesn't have anything, the text speaks of her as being spiritually alive. And the widow who's turned in on herself with her resources is like the walking dead. So as such, this person has no claim on the resources of the church. Now, one quick last point of emphasis for the church here before we make our final application, and that is this. If you look at verse 7, it tells Timothy, Paul tells Timothy, command these things. He's saying to say this to the church. These truths are for the church at large, not just for Timothy, the pastor, or the elders, or the paid personnel. Here's the uniqueness of Christianity. Christianity is lived out by us all. It's not just paid persons who are asked to do so. This is a participatory sport, not a spectator sport. And sometimes we miss that. We think, if I'll just watch the service, I've done my penance. But Christianity is calling for you to step in and be a participant. It's asking that from the church at large here. Every member is being asked to care for the needy. It is your responsibility as much as it is anyone else's. You're accountable, church, to participate in whatever the church's plan is to physically and relationally care for those who are in need. By the same token, it's participatory by the widow herself who receives this aid. She is to give herself to prayer, give her life in service. This is necessary in the give and the take of what family life is within the church. So the text is crying for us, honor widows who are truly widows. In fact, if we would do this, I'm going to propose this to you. We are most like God when we execute justice for the vulnerable and the needy among us. There's a passage back in Deuteronomy, the Old Testament. You know, the Old Testament it's just a mean God in some people's eyes or an irrelevant. In Deuteronomy, which is the second giving of the law, Moses gives this right before he's going to die. He describes the Lord in this way. He says, for the Lord your God, this is in chapter 10, verse 17 and 18. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who is partial to none and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and he loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. We are most like God when we execute justice for the most vulnerable and needy among us. What is the practicality of that for South Durham Church? I'm going to tell you, yes, this is related to widows within our body, where there are women, especially women, it can be men, but especially women, who are in a position of relational aloneness and economic need with no family resource. We have a responsibility to them. But I'm going to tell you, the applications go beyond that. I can look out among you, and I know some of you who are working in the school system. And you're working with persons in your classes that they have no resource or very little stability. Your execution of justice on their behalf and care for them is joining God in His nature and His character. I know some of you who are in the medical field out there and have seen and heard stories of how you have encountered patients and cared for them with support, even to your own risk at times. I know some of you have neighbors that live near you. You might be in a complex where there's others who they don't necessarily have a church home or they don't have family near. They're here, have moved from all relational connections as far as that's concerned. And you have the opportunity to join them. South Durham, there's people all around us. And there's people among us. I wonder, do we even know what their material needs are? I actually think, and what I observe is that we do a decent job of that here. It's more than material needs. It's do we give them the relational needs that they need? I've watched you do this with persons, this is outside of our church body. I've watched you do this with persons who are what would be the sojourner in the verse we read from Deuteronomy. I know some of you helped with refugees that were in the area and helped them with transportation and just, I've seen it in your ordinary day-to-day rhythm of life, caring for others. And I just want to encourage you that if we want to make a genuine impact on a huge global scale, it's going to be driven by the way that we live our ordinary day-to-day life. You may not get instant credibility for that. It may take decades, but the fruit of it will be so much more solid and steady. You know, you're getting bombed every day with global news stories. And you hear constantly Christians responding to this. News stories from within the church and news stories outside of the church, politically or nationally. And frankly, we're being watched. As we respond to those things, our testimony is being established. And I want to beg you to understand this. Our testimony is not made or broken by some critic's argument against our truth. There's tons of politically correct positions where our response is going to be dismissed. Your testimony, though, is going to be made based on the daily, sacrificial, others-first way in which we live. If you're a widow and you find yourself in that destitute place, I want to encourage you, serve as you can and trust the Lord alone. Pray for your church and care. And church, I want to encourage you, honor those who are vulnerable among us, who give themselves to us as unto the Lord. Love them like your family and provide for them as true children provide for their mothers and fathers. Maybe if we would do such, the world will know that we love the Lord because of the love that we have for one another. Would to God that He would help us do this.